arts, in fact. And today we're going to get close, we're going to get intimate with a fabulous novelist. So glad to see you, Meaghan. Meaghan Delahunt, an equally fabulous novelist and essayist, Kirsty Gunn. So both of them will be in conversation on Meaghan's new book, The Night Side of the Country. And so without much more ado, I'll invite Kirsty to start, and then they'll talk for about 20 to 30 minutes, after which all of us can pile in and ask them interesting discussions, ask them interesting questions, and start interesting discussions about the actual book, which I was quite taken by. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gail. And what a lovely kind of summary introduction, and lovely to be here and to see so many old friends. And as Gail said, this is an event that we're going to record for our Imagine Spaces website. And it's part of what we think of as an ongoing series of discussions and communications about the power of literature here at Dundee that began with literary salons and are now being taken up with our work in Imagine Spaces and with Dura, as Gail said. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Meaghan Delahunt to this discussion. Meaghan and I are such old friends and have been in happy discussion in a number of other venues and fora, including Dundee. I think, Meaghan, you've been to speak at least twice, and I feel it might be more.
More times than that, many more times, yeah, over the years, yeah.
Always just lovely to have you with us again. And yes, as Gail said, we're here to talk about your fabulous novel, and we're here to talk about what novels can do, and about how novels can be essays, and they can be a kind of intimate journal. They can be a means of recording all kinds of thoughts, ideas that may sit outside the text and may also belong within it, and come to weave their way between those two places to give us a new kind of reading experience. Meaghan, I wonder if, by way of beginning, if you could introduce yourself to everybody, and then by way of a lovely introduction to your book, read from it for a few minutes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, thank you, Kirsty, and thank you, Gail, for the lovely introductions, and very, very happy to be here and in discussion with my old and dear friend Kirsty about this novel. As Kirsty said, and as Gail said, so this is my new novel. It came out last year in Australia, and now it's on audiobook and ebook. Hasn't come out in the UK yet. And it's called The Night Side of the Country. And I think I'll just start straight from the first couple of pages. And I guess it's about a lot of different things. There's two women in it. There's a woman, a writer called M, and another woman called B. They're both on the run from male violence, I guess you could say. And we're never really sure if B is a figment of M's imagination or if she's actually her character. And towards the end of the book, they're more in dialogue about these sort of things. But I'm just going to start from the more essayistic beginning. And this is in M's voice. The days drew in and the men fell hard. Not all of them fell, to be sure, not nearly enough. It was a log roll of men down a long river, and you stood on the banks, waiting, watching, taking note, as they jostled for space in the water, seeming to steady, seeming to right themselves until, as sudden as it was unexpected, the plunge to the rocks below. After this, who could go on as before? Certainly, you were changed. And what of the story? At first, you thought of a fugitive, a woman running from her past, a woman tracking the roads her life has taken. The woman is still a fugitive, but in this time of the felled men, she steps forward, she speaks up, and this has consequences. In this, you realize she is just like you. There is the man who suffers and the man who writes, to paraphrase T.S. Eliot. Lucky Mr. Eliot, striding to the bank, writing poems in between the ledgers. The suffering man kept separate from the writing man. And in any case, there was always at least one Mrs. Elliot to watch over him. But what about the woman who suffers and the woman who writes? At this particular moment, the one bleeds into the other. You're not blessed with a stiff upper lip, cojones, or a gift for compartmentalization. Art is not life and life is not art, but now everything starts to blur. And you've arrived at the point where the woman who writes and the woman who suffers are not so separate. You front up to the page to confront the woman writing and the woman being written. You are living through night in your country and trying to fend off the night. Perhaps you should become a male poet, a male bank manager. Perhaps you are in need of a wife. After W, the first man, floods past, you believe that things will be different, even in your own small life. You rake over the years. What happened back then? You listen to these other women, some famous and others not famous at all, and see that it's no longer about the one woman. No. The one voice now harmonizes with the many to form a strange music. Those who hear it for the first time shake their heads and ask themselves, as if woken from a trance, why did we not hear this before? For this music is not new. It's been playing for centuries. But it was women who sang this lament for the fallen, the outcast, the bruised, a lament for themselves. And who, down the centuries, could listen to that? So just finish there.
Meaghan, thank you so much. Beautifully read, as always. We've got so much to talk about this afternoon. One of the things that I think immediately comes to mind is the texture of your prose and the sound of it. I was just reading last night, the New Zealand poet Bill Manhire was talking about, in this current PN review, about the idea of poetry, the sound, he put it, the kind of musicality of thinking. And it seems to me that this is a book that's about thinking. This is why we very much want to keep it within our imagined spaces, essaying discussion. It's a book in dialogue with itself, about ideas, about gender, about violence, but also about storytelling, about the nature of the novel itself. And all the time, what we're hearing is this beautiful music of a voice. And there are a range of voices too, obviously, because the book has dialogue, and we've got the character of B, who has a very different kind of voice, although she's also kind of connected to the narrative voice. So all the time we have this beautiful kind of oral sound, a kind of soundscape in the book. I wonder if we could begin by asking you to talk to us a little bit about where the book came from and the degree to which this sound, this speaking with yourself, was there from the beginning, if it was something you found as you went along.
Yeah, well, it's always hard to say where things begin, isn't it? The actual beginning. I had been writing, or I had written and published a short story called To Pick Up a Stone, which is referenced in this book, and it's not exactly the same as what's in this novel. But like M, the writer here, I had written a piece called To Pick Up a Stone for the Book of Iona, which was edited by Robert Crawford, so quite a few years ago. And that was a big project, a whole lot of us involved, a bit like Imagined Spaces, actually, you know, artists and scientists and so on, all writing and contributing and doing different things for the Book of Iona. So that was a short story set on Iona. And the woman character turned out in this novel to be B. I wasn't quite finished with her. I knew she was on the run. I didn't know exactly why she ended up on Iona. So I was kind of toying with this new novel for a few years about this character called B, although I didn't know what her name was at the time. And then we fast forward so that's probably from 2014 or 15 to 2017. And then Weinstein and the Me Too movement and everything like that. And then I found, like many women around the world, I just found that my own perspective on things that had happened to me in the past and even in the present had shifted, and that things had been radically altered, and things that we thought were okay up until around October 2017. I think if anybody's seen the Fran Lebowitz documentary on Netflix, she talks about it almost like, I think she says, up until 2017, we had Adam and Eve, we had the patriarchy like this. And then since then, things have shattered and splintered quite a bit. And there's still, I think it's going to keep going on. So certainly I felt shattered and splintered. And I just couldn't get back to the novel that I was writing. And it took a good 6 months to build myself back up again, I would say. And I didn't think I was able to go back to the novel that I've been writing. And but then I worked out a way to kind of create a dialogue with what I'd been doing before. So I guess it was a dialogue with the notes that I was making during this very difficult time of reevaluation, of, soul searching too, in a lot of ways, and feeling very splintered and fractured, and being thrown back to being a young woman on a dark street, as M is in the book. And how do you confront trauma, I guess? So I had these two parallel things. I was writing about things in my notebooks and journals and keeping away from the novel. And then I tried to work out a way in which I could combine them. And as you said, Kirsty, it's very much a book about ideas, about the creation of a novel, about the creative writing industry, about what women go through as writers, as people in that industry as well. I was going to read out the bit where M is at a version of the book festival at Charlotte Square, and she's being questioned by these men in the audience, but I might read that later. But yeah, so in the end, all of that came together, I guess.
I would really like to press you. I'd like to really press you on that, because I think this theme, this idea of a book making itself, and of we the reader being part of that kind of breathless, terrified, uncertain project, is part of the book's experience. I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that I read it in one sitting. I gave it to my sister, who read it in one sitting, my daughter, who read it in one sitting. And I think part of this is because we feel that necessity, that drive to bring everything together and to bring the book into being with the writer. And you're making a very conscious decision, aren't you, to make us think about these things, because you give us a kind of redacted self. That narrative voice is immediately fractured, as you just said, into the second person, into the idea that that the narrator is herself in dialogue with other stories. So B's story at a certain point takes over, and that then becomes the story, the novel within the novel.
Yeah.
And then, as you said right at the beginning, and it's there in your reading, you're thinking about all of these other kinds of selves that women are as writers. And you give us old Eliot there, sitting with poor old Vivian locked up somewhere in the background, right, creating his endless pieces of important literature. By contrast, each of them arriving fully, they arrive into the world as though upon enormous classical tablets of stone are engraved the words of T.S. Eliot. By contrast, we have this beautiful, frail, hesitant, making itself up thing that is your novel. Can you talk a little more now then about this process? You've given us a beautiful image of time happening on all kinds of levels, things happening then then adding to this bit of the story now, keeping journals and so on. Can you give us a little more insight into that making process? Because part of that tone that I opened asking you about, part of that music that is the sound of this novel, seems to be the music of someone making her work and making something that's finished. Can you talk about that process?
Yeah, I didn't address the musicality or the rhythm of things, but, you know, as you and I believe in that kind of attention to the musicality of the sentence, the rhythm of the work, the patterning, you know, of language. Language is very important, and how you pattern that. Yeah, if it feels more like a soundscape or something, I don't know that's so different from other things I've written. I mean, I think also part of that comes from, you know, being half deaf, I think. And so I have to, everything in my head is very loud. And then when I write, you know, I close myself off completely. So I'm completely deaf. And then I'm banging out the rhythms often with a pencil or reading them back to myself, but I'm only in my head, I can hear it. So, but yes, with this one, because it was mainly down to two voices, and at a certain point they become very, you know, they're very distinct. I had to try and get that right, you know, and I was, you know, as we know, by the time you get to the endless series of drafts, things are pretty conscious by that stage. And I was conscious that, you know, as I came towards the final draft, that M's voice was more measured, more essayistic, all that sort of thing. And B was this character that kind of rushes in, and, you know, she's from somewhere indeterminate. She's pretty much grown up in a place like Northern Ireland, but, you know, lived in London, moved to Glasgow. So her voice has a lot of other things in it too. And I wanted that collision of those things. But also I think it was very important to have M sounding a certain way, because in the novel, as in life, off the page, you know, there's the accusation of women being slightly hysterical, particularly when they talk about issues of violence. You know, that women, and I think that, you know, women can't be trusted. Their voices are too high. They give themselves away. They're hysterical. And so I'm deliberately working against that with M's voice.
That's just fascinating for me to hear, because I think that is the music of this, the tone of it, the key signature, if you like, has enormous sadness, and there's this kind of resignation to it. But there's obviously anger, but that has been tempered by a note that feels very grave and measured and deeply, deeply sad. We're getting little remarks in the chat box, and Nicole's just had a question about Doris Lessing, which I think is absolutely perfect. Gail, with your permission, I know you said that, you know, we're going to kind of wait for questions. I'd love this to be a more open discussion. And if people want to come in at any point where there's something in particular that's, you know, pressing on their own writing practice, or an intellectual quick question they may have in relation to Meaghan's text, I think it's a brilliant thing to bring them in. Nicole, would you like to talk a little more about that?
Sorry, just finding the unmute button. Yeah, thanks, Meaghan. I really enjoyed the excerpts from the book that was shared with us, and I've been working my way through Doris Lessing's fiction. I was just wondering if that was something you were conscious of working with in the book. So, for example, you know, the way that she writes about the place of women within kind of communist or socialist political organizations, and books like The Good Terrorist, or, you know, the speculative fiction that she writes as well. For example, the marriages between zones 3, 4, and 5, where you have these sort of veils between worlds that kind of separate different versions of women's lives that sort of correlate with kind of real world experiences. So I guess I'm just wondering if that was something that you were working with or were thinking about.
No, not really, not with this book, but it's I haven't read any of her speculative fiction, but she was, you know, The Golden Notebook was a very pivotal book for me when I was a young communist. And actually it propelled, reading that book made me realize that I could live a different life. I didn't have to go on in the party like I had been, you know, the Socialist Workers' Party at the time, in the same way that Doris Lessing had been in the Communist Party. And the character of Anna, you know, you could leave. That here was a woman who was living on her own terms. She'd been very politically active as a young woman, like I had been. And, you know, me as a young woman reading Doris Lessing's book about that had a huge impact on my life, because I realized, wow, I can leave. So on that level, I would say Doris Lessing. No, more of a guiding light. Again, another kind of very progressive, very left-wing writer was Ursula Le Guin for this book. And so, you know, I read The Left Hand of Darkness when I was very young again. You know, again, that would have been a pivotal text for a young socialist feminist at the time, you know, in the 80s. And, but I went back more, I guess, in line with my own thinking now too, you know, to her work on Taoism, her work on the novel. You know, she's written really beautifully about writing, and this particular speech about the night side of the country. So it was more Ursula Le Guin than Doris Lessing. But it's interesting. God, as soon as I heard you say Doris Lessing, I thought, oh my God, you know, it really hit me, because that book, you know, changed my life at the time. Physically.
Well, we never write alone, do we?
No,
This is an issue of gender, but it's also a literary fact that there's a kind of chorus of voices that women will acknowledge in their writing practice and in their reading practice, in a way that the male canonical approach to literature would be in denial of, or if we're not in denial about it, we're in some kind of agonistic Bloomsian struggle, you know, with the giants of the past. You're talking about acknowledging all of these things that are part of a kind of imaginary dreamscape that then feeding into your own, into the books that you make. Gail has a question about your use of the second person, and I think I just saw that in the chat box. Gail, would you like to come in here, because I think that relates to this acknowledgement of a kind of communal reading, or a shared reading, a shared writing?
Yes, I mean, it was, I was really interested in your description of book as in some ways speaking to your fractured sense of self after the Weinstein kind of, you know, that the whole news about Harvey Weinstein burst on to media. And I saw that the fracture might actually speak to the different personas of self, or different kinds of selves. But there is a tension between that and what I see also in the novel as a kind of ownership of self. So this is me, this is someone who might be me. And there's a lovely section right in the middle of the book, I think, thereabout, and about chapter 15, where you say something like, B watches you writing, then she says, it's time. You look up from the pages still thinking about B, the man who visited her, the mask people wear, the idea of the safe house. Time for what? Time to drop the you, you say. And this is B talking to M. No, but she says, I want you to be distant, you say, general, to escape from the me. And so could I just invite you to talk a little bit about that use of the you, which to some extent might be the actual narrator addressing herself. She comes in later on in that famous chapter 15, you move from the I, the we to the you, and it just blurs between all three. It moves in a kind of Protean fashion. But I'm really interested in second person, because second person is often used in novels in that way. And I'm quite interested in how person as in some ways an interpellative, this is me addressing you, inviting you into the novel, but also this is me distancing myself from you, as the narrator distances herself from you. So could you say a little bit more about that use of pronouns in the novel?
Yeah, I think you've said it beautifully, Gail. I would say exactly the way you finished there. You know, it's really interesting that often often a writer can end up in dialogue with something they don't actually like, and I've always found the way it's used more conventionally in novels very tricky. Haven't always enjoyed it, and I think it's very tricky for those reasons, that sometimes it can seem as if it's overly intimate. It's drawing you into a worldview that you do not share, and particularly for women, and people of color, you're often drawn into, this very male you that's generalizing, and so I've often come up against that in my reading, and I don't like it. The other side that you've hit on is a distancing, and I love the way we do use that in English, in particular. We can say you in the same way that we can say them or we. We can make it more general, but we can also distance. What I became really, or I have always been very interested in it, is the way that trauma is embodied, the way that trauma affects the voice and voicing of trauma, and the fracturing of self that goes on with that, and the way that we, how do we come to inhabit our own stories? And by the time I came to realize what I was trying to do here, I realized that in order for M to gain ownership over her trauma of what happened to her, which is exactly the point at which Gail's talking about, where the book switches, and B, who's ostensibly M's character, is forcing the narrator M to step into the I, step into your own story. And I give a sly nod to Rebecca Sonnet there, who says that a free person tells her own story, but the steps to be free to me are always very difficult. They can be very difficult psychologically for people that have been through all sorts of trauma to voice it. But the importance of telling stories, which to me seemed the whole point of the Me Too movement and the subsequent, what we've seen this year after the death of Sarah Everhard, what we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement, is that people who felt marginalized stepping into the I, telling the story. And then the other key thing I think in this book is that it's all one story. My individual story, M's individual trauma in the book, B's trauma as well, and the story of male violence affects all women. That it's all one story ultimately, and it needs to be believed. It needs to be voiced and it needs to be believed. So yes, it was very, very deliberate playing with all of that. Every time the pronoun is used, it's very deliberate. But again, getting back to what I was saying to Kirsty before, I wanted M's voice to be slightly distant, slightly a higher register than I would normally use for a character like that. And yes, she's deliberately using the you to invite you into the story, but also distance herself from her own trauma, for sure.
I think these things are really fascinating for our kind of essaying adventure at Dundee on imagined spaces and elsewhere, because by complicating this use of first person and second person, acknowledging that they're related, but also thinking quite seriously about the responsibilities that come with both. And then of course we've got the famous essaying first person plural, or the impersonal first person, the impersonal third person, that wretched one, who on earth is she? I think all of these things are present as very lively themes and ideas in your book. And there's a sense all the time that the narration is having this kind of agonistic dance. Is this about redaction? Is this about things being held back? Is it about experience being contained within quite a lot of quite serious opinion? There's lots of reading, there's lots of research that's gone on for the book as well, in terms of history of gender violence and psychological information, all this kind of thing, the extent to which that is being used as a kind of containment. and then the way that the narrative voice is allowed in, and as you've pointed out, what that one part of the book, inviting to use the first person. In the same way, we have at other points, no, are we on, I think, you know, she says something like, are we just going to use first letters?
Is it initials only? Yeah.
Initials only.
Yeah.
And of course, right from the beginning, when we open the first page, and you just read from that, the way that you hangs unhoused in the air. You know, who is this you? Is this me? Is this the book talking to me? Or is the book the you, the I, and so on? So all of these things, are we talking here, and I wonder now if this is the point to open things up to everybody, are we talking about a kind of female writing that allows this kind of essaying, porous, open-ended relationship with how a story is told and who's going to tell it? Are we talking about a kind of literature that in a way is saying, I don't mind?
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I had a lot of fun with that. Once I realized, wow, they're in conversation. And, you know, I was having fun with that creative writing trope of, you know, the character comes in and takes over the novel. So I was having a lot of fun with that. And yeah, but I think all those things you're talking about, you know, I think uncertainty is a revolutionary principle for me in life as in art, you know, and I think it invites people in, and it's against exactly what you were talking that earlier, the, you know, canonical male, white male writer, and the notions of individual male genius too. I think we have, you know, and if this novel's about anything, it's about kind of trying to destabilize all of that. And open things up a bit more. And also, as you noticed, you know, it is a book about writing. It's a book about writing a novel.
Yeah.
How do things, but it's a book in which the character knows much more about the narrator than the narrator does about the character, which mirrors really the way a novel is constructed, or the way I would construct a novel, the way I construct a novel. You know, I find out what I'm doing as I'm going.
Yeah.
And so there's all that stuff in it too.
I mean, what's really delicious, Meaghan, to hear you talk is that you may well be describing a poem, and you certainly, as far as Gail and I are concerned, are describing an essay. I mean, we talked about this when the book came out, and I'd read it for the first time. Mm-hmm. That one is allowing the novel to be this other kind of thing that is unmoored and certainly free of all of those trappings of certainty. To be very certain about being uncertain is a very different thing from just being certain. Can you give us some thoughts, please, about how much you think the novel can do this, help us with this job of thinking and uncertainty, how it can perhaps help us come to terms with nuance and open-ended endings that have no ending. In other words, the extent to which the novel can resist those novelistic conventions, because it seems to me that a lot of people talk about doing that and purport to be doing it, and indeed are even published as and critiqued as though they are doing it, but aren't doing it. Can you tell us a little, perhaps in context with your other, and you know, bringing in some of your other earlier novels, the extent to which you feel that you're really wanting to make your novel something that's not a novel, if that makes sense?
I mean, I don't think it's the first time that I've done it, but it's the first time I've done it in this way. You know, so the Red Book, my second novel, was constructed as a book of photographs. So yeah, but I've always kind of played with so-called fact, you know, historical facts, political facts, and fiction, and collided those kind of worlds in my work. That runs all the way through too, because I'm interested in that. Here, I just kind of took those things a bit of a step further, I think. And yeah, I do clearly though remember the day when I thought, am I going to do this? Am I going to put this, am I going to step into the I? Can I do that? You know, all the way through, I kept saying to myself, can I do this? Can I have, you know, M in conversation with B about the novel they're writing? And I go, yeah, I can.
Yeah.
Can I do this? And then I had to stop saying to myself, can I do it? Because it was obvious I was doing it, you know. And so I thought, okay, I'm just going to push this as far as it can go for this. And can I have more than one ending? It seems that that's what I've done, you know. But all the way through, I mean, it was a very uncertain kind of process. But you know, I always find writing like that anyway. But this felt more seat of the pants, I think, kind of white knuckle. Because I was dealing, I guess, with aspects of my own trauma, you know, trying to, what would you call that? Like a metamorphosis or something, you know.
Yeah.
It's not a direct transposition. It's not direct from life, but certainly trying to find a means to get at that was preventing me from writing in the first place. And how do we creatively deal with trauma? You know, I was dealing with that. That was a big psychological issue all the way through. And then I found I was doing all these things and I had to stop questioning myself and just say, do it.
And of course, to that extent, the novel gives us a curious kind of safety, doesn't it? Because in the end, it is a place that's been made. It's been constructed, imagined. It's a fictional place.
Yeah.
And unlike the essay, which may use elements of fiction and bring them in, along with poetry and all kinds of other things. But ultimately, the novel is made up. That's what it's about. It's about making something up. And that gives you a kind of freedom to then be able to be very, very free with personal information, with the complications of your own past, with, as I know, although we may not talk about it in this context, possibilities for legal action and so on that may be taken up off the back of pieces that you'd published in the New York Times and in other places. So the novel gives us this wonderful escape clause. It was just a story.
Exactly. And it is, you know, it is all fiction. Even if it sounds essayistic, you know, and that's a deliberate tonal thing, and you think, oh, that sounds very factual, but it's not, you know. And yeah, it's all carefully constructed and fictionalized as well. And then we have the pure fiction, you know, well, you know, M and B constructing this work of fiction. You know, so there's different layers to it. But yeah, getting back to that earlier question that I don't think I quite answered it, but I think the novel can do anything you want it to. And I think having gone through everything I went through with this novel and to get it to that point, and so many resistances, you know, so you know, my agent here said, what kind of book is this? Nobody's going to read it. Nobody's going to publish it. We can't categorize it. You know, so a lot of difficulties. And then, you know, my Australian agent got a publisher. As soon as we get the publisher, it looks like they're going to go under. So then it didn't look like the book was coming out. It felt like there's so many obstacles, you know. There was not only obstacles in the writing of it, but in obstacles to get it out into the world. But having gone through all of that, it has given me a greater sense of confidence in my own work, in my own perseverance. I mean, you know, you and I talk about that quite a lot in our discussions. But yeah, to just say, do it.
Yeah. Well, it makes the whole...
Stop questioning yourself. Can I just, you realize you're doing it and say, cut the questions. You're doing it.
Yeah. It certainly is we certainly do start to wonder as we read the book, the extent to which we've internalized patriarchal, canonical ideas of story and what our expectations are in terms of the way the content's managed and that kind of drive towards a resolution. Gail, you were going to come in with a question. You had something in the chat.
I don't really want to hog the conversation, but I am intrigued because in some ways it's a very risky venture what you're attempting here, which is to think about storytelling, to think about first person and what first person means, because it could be an active witness, but it also can be an invented kind of linguistic, rhetorical kind of subject of sorts. But you're taking us through all of that inventiveness you have in terms of fiction, but you're using actually a subject, which is the Me Too, which is sexual violence. And that's so in some ways not, to my mind, it's very difficult to talk about sexual violence and trauma in an inventive way. And so it seems to me that all sorts of risk attached to this whole venture. Because once you say, well, this is fictive, this is not really fictive, then you don't have that charge of bearing witness in which a lot of these stories kind of cohere around. So I wondered if you could say something a little bit about the risk involved in all of this.
Oh, I think writing is a risky business in general, and I think, and that's part of the thrill of it and the joy of it and the reason why we do it. If it was easy and straightforward, there's that Catherine Mansfield quote, isn't there, Kirsty? But it's the, is it Catherine Mansfield or Woolf? The difficult thing is what one is drawn to. It's the difficult thing, one wants to do, to paraphrase. And I think with each book and each thing, each story, each essay, it's always a challenge, and it's the way the material comes to you suggests the form of it. For me, it's as I'm drawing, the form take shape. But I love playing around with language. In my first novel, I switched a lot between pronouns as well, and with that kind of kaleidoscope of stories. So I just love language and I love playing with it. And yes, but I think your question of, yes, how do we speak about something like sexual violence? How does the imagination deal with that?
That's a lovely line you used, and I wondered whether there was a bit of stock taking as the novel went on. The line was, some experiences are beyond the realms of language, and this occurs again somewhere in chapter 15. That chapter 15 was really, it took me a long while to get my head around that chapter 15, because it was throwing so many plates in the air at the same time.
Yes. Yeah. And I clearly remember the day that I thought, I'm going to change the pronouns. I have to, this is the moment at which I have to do that. And it was the scariest feeling. It was so exhilarating too, when I left it like that. And
but when you say there's some experience beyond the reach of language,
I can speak to that. It's I mean, that is directly addressing what we know about trauma and the way trauma is embodied, and the way that we can have an experience, when we're 2 years old, and it can, rear its head when we're 62 or something, because it was encoded in the body. Trauma is encoded in a way that's beyond words. The way it stores in our memory, the way trauma is stored in our memory is very different from other memories. And it is actually it's a physical trigger that will allow you to voice it, even years and years later. So that's a very deliberate thing from reading about trauma and understanding trauma. And I have a partner who's a therapist, who's a counselor, who deals with childhood trauma as well. So yeah, I mean, that's all in there. We know that a lot of trauma and a lot of the things that I think in particular women go through, and small children of both sexes, are beyond language. So how do you give voice to those?
Meaghan, I'd like to ask you more about that, because the book absolutely encodes that, you know, not only in terms of that sound that I talked about earlier, but there are so many references throughout to how the narrator is feeling. And it's as though a kind of pulse is being, but we're checking the pulse of this novel all the time. You know, is everything going to be okay? Is the teller going to be okay? But also, is the tale going to be okay? You know, is this story going to be one that is brought out into the light and made to be whole and healthy? There are all of these issues. I'd like to bring Hannah in here, because she has a question about the degree to which, again, as women, forging, making these new kinds of fiction that are communal and shared, whether there's some kind of meshing that's gone on in these recent years since the Me Too movement, where there's been an awareness of this silencing of female experience and trauma, and that is now being allowed to come up to the surface. Is that then going to allow us finally to create a different kind of literature about men and women, and about vulnerability? Hannah, would you like to come in at this point?
Yes, thank you. I think it's that concept of storytelling being something that we need, and we need it to be fit for purpose, and then it's a good thing to question what that looks like at different points in time. And I wonder how much as readers we're changing our concept of story at the moment, now that we have these sort of mechanisms post-scandals, post-tragedies, where people come out and they tell their stories and they voice things, and it's in dialogue. It's something that where stories kind of add together and accumulate. And I wonder if that shifts our view of what a story is and what we're prepared to kind of accept as something that we read, and how that's built, something that is much more in conversation and dialogue and is less certain. And just Kirsty was saying, we don't know there's a happy ending, and we're questioning that all the way through. But as you were speaking, Meaghan, I was also wondering, it's the same as true of writing. Are we at the moment where we're prepared to accept that kind of writing? Are we feeling like that it's actually changing and moving on in that way to something that can be different because times are different?
Hello, Hannah.
Hi.
Yeah, well, I think things are always changing, whether we recognize them or not. We're always, you know, I've said this before too, you know, we're always living through an historical moment. We just often don't realize it. I think at the moment we do realize it. We've got COVID. I think during Me Too and Black Lives Matter, we realized, you know, we were living through an historical moment. Sometimes, you know, history erupts in such a way that we can't avoid it. And then how does that impact on the individual? Or in the case of women and people of color, groups of individuals, you know? And yes, I think inevitably it has to shake us up and shake up the novel. One of the things I was also very aware of with this novel, and aware of with Me Too, and aware of women in general, you know, is that popular culture, literary culture, loves it when women display their wounds. You know, if I show you my stigmata, you know, if I show you everything I've been through. And that was another reason for all the playfulness in this novel with pronouns and so on. Just because a woman, you know, uses the I in a certain way doesn't mean that everything the woman is writing is autobiographical, or that she's going to show you her wounds in exactly the way they happened. You know, I'm a bit, there's also the flip side of women telling their stories, isn't there? The way that they can be used and abused again. And I think women are, no matter their literary achievements, often, you know, women are expected to show their wounds rather than their literary playfulness or skill, you know. So I there's a kind of two-sided thing to the storytelling, and then how women are positioned when they tell stories. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's certainly, I've read of that happening in sort of journalism now, where young journalists are encouraged to be very open about their experiences, because that will get them the article that will propel them forward, because it will get more interest and more clicks. And the idea that that's actually harmful is really interesting. But this idea that fiction is a mechanism and a tool that we have to say, let's work with it in that way, so we can bring these subjects to the light and work them around and play with them in a way that isn't just about sort of exposing a trauma or something that's been there.
Well, this frames beautifully a couple of questions that are coming in the chat room, which maybe presses further this idea of a kind of shared fiction, a kind of shared writing, something that feels collective and choral. We have Johanna asking about this concept of duration, and Ellie about whether Australia is more open to other places, to reading a kind of more challenging feminist text. Certainly Gail and I have been discovering in our essaying adventure that a lot of the most exciting stuff coming out about essays and a new kind of writing, a different kind of feminine, a huge amount of interesting stuff on essays there. And also Johanna's idea of time seems to be being attended to in similar terms, that the essay is a place that is timeless. It is not about an individual dramatic expression. It's rather creating a forum that can be kind of endlessly expanded to take in other voices, other ideas. Johanna and Ellie, would you like to come in and adumbrate some of those ideas that are coming up in the chat box there?
Yeah, yeah, thanks for that much more kind of coherent summary of what I was trying to say. But I guess maybe I want to push a little bit on the idea of the essay as timeless, and ask whether there might just be a kind of different type of time, or a different type of kind of relationship to the historical, that can kind of play out in certain types of experimental or hybrid, or whatever you want to call the sort of genre bending kind of expressions that we might be kind of referring to here. And that's to do with, I guess I get a little bit nervous about the idea of something like Me Too being a kind of, spontaneous watershed that changes everything, because obviously, and I don't think anybody would, I don't think anybody's saying differently, but obviously it's an expression of something that's much longer, that's much kind of more based on maybe less visible, but as kind of crucial kind of processes of organization. And, that makes me think about the kind of earlier comments Meaghan and Nicole were making about both kind of leftist organizing and other kind of forms of organizing. And I just wonder if there's something to be said about how writing, however we want to define it, can do something to our thinking about kind of time, or thinking about chronologies, or thinking about how events kind of manifest in a particular time and in a particular space, and for particular people, and then the way obviously that those events impact different types of people, I think is crucial to pay attention to as well.
I'm always interested in time, and the novel is always playing with time in perhaps a slightly different way to the essay, but there's so much crossover with both of those things. Well, we know at the level of dreams and of the unconscious, time has no real meaning. It's almost like an eternal present at the level of the unconscious and dreams. If something happens to you at 2, a bit like I was talking about before, something happens at 2, but it comes back at 62, because the way it's been embedded at that level, time has collapsed, really, in a way. And in a sense, this is what this book is trying to do too with trauma. Yeah, and I agree with you with Me Too, of course. I mean, but again, that's one of those moments where history kind of erupts through the there's all this work that's been going on and building on what generations of progressive women have done before, and progressive people in general, men and women. And history, you know, it kind of erupts to the surface in a certain way. And then it calms down again, and then the struggle continues, I think. But getting time, I mean, there's, you know, Helene Sixou talks about narrative time and women's time. And I think women, you know, we do have our own biological time. Yeah. Times in our life, our biological rhythms are a certain way. Men's biological rhythms are a certain way.
And yet we're stuck with the quotidian unit of the novel, which is an expression of time. Unlike the poem, unlike the essay, we know about time by the thickness of a spine. I mean, there's something that goes on in our reading experience that's asking us to read in this other kind of way that's very aware of the ticking of the clock. And of course, the traditional novel is obsessed with it, isn't it? With the use of prolepsis and analepsis, a kind of the architecture of timepieces runs through the history of the novel.
And it drives to the end.
Yeah. But even at the night side of the country, we see this book arriving in the bookshops and on our desks, and we look at it, unlike we look at a poem, and we see our time that's going to be spent moving through the pages of this book, and how we do that too, don't we? We see, oh, there's this much to go. Something's going on all the time about what the novel is going to be asking us to resolve or not. And I love the way this novel, again, checks its pulse. You know, where's the catharsis? Where's the moment of relief coming here? When am I going to know who's who and what's real and to what extent is this trauma something that's been expressed on the page and is therefore no longer part of the narration? To what extent has your splitting, which has been your subject, been achieved? All of these things go on deliciously in our novel reading. I'm just thinking about Johanna's question about this issue of how we find, and Ellie, who I'd like you to come in next, because I do think there's something going on in Australia that is very interesting in terms of making us think again about our relationship with the sentence and the paragraph on the page as a unit of time.
Can I just say something before that about Australia? I mean, Australia's always had amazing women essayists, and, you know, and also novelists who cross that line. And, you know, the chief exponent of that is Helen Garner. She's been doing this for decades. You know, it's not unusual. And that was one of the things I had to go into battle with for this book in the UK, really, and with my agent at the time, saying, you know, there's places in the world where this stuff is being done, you know, Latin America as well, Europe in general, much more open to hybrid kind of forms. To me, the UK has always been stuck with the notion of the 19th century novel. And that's the education system, everything. And you know, what Kirsty was saying about the size of the book, often it's measured, its literary gravitas is measured by something that's really big and thick, isn't it? We think this is a novel, I'm going to invest my time in its time, you know. But yes, I'll just hear what Ellie wants to say about Australia now.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting. Yeah, I mean, my point was that I put in the chat that there were a couple of books that had come to mind during the discussion, and I realised that both of them were Australian. And yeah, I'm actually just interested. Maybe the question would be, and you've sort of started to answer it, what is it about the UK and the UK publishing scene that's holding back? But it's not just on the experimental hybrid forms. It's also around challenging feminist texts as well. I'm interested in that because I spent 3 years in Australia, and it's, you know, in some ways it's, I would say, less accepting to feminist ideas in the general kind of atmosphere of being in Australia, but somehow the literature is, and maybe that's the answer, maybe it's tackling harder things and therefore it's bubbling up in the literature. But yeah, any insight that you had on that I'd find fascinating.
It's really strange. I've always found it more gendered here than in Australia. Certainly university life, and fewer protections for women and people of colour. Not having a written constitution in the UK, I think that's a real issue for all of these kind of things about race, about gender, where Australia has had that and has had all this legislation in place since the 70s, you know, and that wasn't quite in place here. So I was kind of shocked when I first came to Scotland and I couldn't call myself Ms., you know, in 1992, whereas he'd been able to do that in Australia. My mother used to say, I get addressed as Ms., you know, she wasn't Mrs. from the 50s anymore. So there was all those, you know, I think that view of Australia, slightly a colonial view of Australia more, that has coloured things and covered up really what the relations between men and women and colonialism and everything here, you know, it's all been covered over because the places that we colonized are much worse than the UK. So I've always, you know, I'm always up against that too, I think, with thinking. But certainly at the moment, there's amazing Australian young essayists and the feminist stuff. It's not seen as beyond the pale in Australia and never has been. You know, it's the publishing industry has allowed for that. And it's a big industry and people buy those books, you know. So it's probably no accident that this book was snapped up in Australia. But, you know, here I've had all these gatekeepers saying, oh, nobody would read it and nobody would publish it and it's too much. How do we classify it? In Australia, yeah, and I do think people like Helen Garner really paved the way for that in the 70s, you know. And there's a lot of exciting young women writers coming out now doing that sort of thing. With the essay in particular, yeah.
Is it something to do, I wonder, with a kind of resistance to charm? I mean, you know, we talk a lot in the UK, don't we, about the idea of art, the whole business of reading being a means to enter an enchanted, charmed space, the charm of the story being taken. What's this phrase that everybody uses? You know, I was lost in the novel. I was, you know, transported. I was carried away, as though somehow the very act of reading is an act of abnegation, a kind of shunting off of responsibilities and deep thinking and making the idea of the novel being a place of ethical judgment and space, all of these kinds of things. Is there something about British fiction that's too transported? And what we're talking about here is something that's far more cognizant of its responsibilities, but also of its responsibilities to be a thinking organism, you know, a thing that invites us to be participatory and judgmental and uncertain, and to be part of that making process that we began the discussion with.
Well, I think there's always been a strong strain in UK literary life that is against anything that's seen as too political or edgy or experimental, in that engaged, you know. As a young teenager, I was so taken with the engaged fiction, engagé or whatever, coming up, you know, from France. Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, Camus, all these people who were very, very literary and imaginative, but also very engaged with their societies and the issues that were going on at the time. But they created these imagined worlds, you know. That's been a strain in French fiction, in German fiction, Spanish fiction. It hasn't really been such a strain in UK fiction. In fact, it's seen as almost déclassé to talk about political issues or so on in a work of art. The work of art is here and everything else is there. And the transporting into the realm of the imagination that isn't supposed to be too disturbing, too difficult. You know, I think all of those things are very, very strong in UK literary and not in Australia.
That's not, I mean, I was gonna half defend, not the novel so much, but in poetry. I mean, I see so many interesting poets with really interesting, you know, really charged up, inventive. You know, I think poetry has just blossomed in this country in a way the novel hasn't quite, maybe. I don't know. I don't read enough novels, perhaps.
I think there's just, you know, a weight of expectations of what a novel looks like.
Yes, yes.
And
I think that's
very Dickensian in my view. You know, and to me, you know, we look at that, the way the novel was also tied up with colonialism. And, you know, we have the fragrant kind of English ladies off in the colonies reading, you know, the installments of Dickens and so on. There's just something about it as this very solid kind of large doorstopper thing that is not going to frighten the horses too much.
There's a phrase that persists in the British novelistic world. The phrase is well written. And whenever I've pressed people who use that expression, what do they mean by that? They mean that it's made up of a certain kind of sentence, that is, and I'm quoting, a good English sentence. Now that means it's parsed correctly. I'm not exaggerating here. This is at the heart of so much novelistic production and critique in the UK, and I believe in Scotland too. I don't think Scotland's free of this. I do think we have a lot more freedom going on in Scotland, and I think a lot more
different here,
and it still persists.
But it still persists in the way writing is talked about, for sure, absolutely. But I think, yes, I mean, the things I'm talking about, I think in Scotland too, there's been, you know, we even have to go back to somebody like James Hogg, even, you know, we can see that things have been done differently in Scotland, in the way they've been done differently in Australia. We've got, you know, America and so on. They're very thorny, interesting questions. But to me, the way that literature is talked about in the whole of the UK is just so staid and conventional.
Yeah.
You know, I think it needs to be, it really needs to be challenged, because other countries, but do very differently, very different traditions. And I think they need to be allowed much more into the discourse really around literature and what is good literature. Is it just this well-written? What does well-written mean exactly?
Yeah, well, this is the thing. This is what's very interesting, is to realize that well-written can be reduced to a kind of an essence of grammar. And
yes, and rhetoric, and a certain way of that we see, I would say, that we see male politicians speaking in public life, and that notion of well spoken. Westminster kind of life, and we see that almost, you know, transposed into literature as well. Yeah, you know, and it's all really problematic, I think. So the more Latinate sentences you use, the more hyperbole, the more bolted on the sentences seem to be. Is that well written? I don't know. And it has to look like a doorstopper for it to contain time. So, you know, if you compare my little book or to that, we would think, oh, there's not much time in that novel because it's so slight. Whereas we know that it doesn't have to be a big thing to contain worlds and time.
Yeah. Maybe, Meaghan, this is a really good point at which to ask if you might bring us back to Charlotte Square, to the centre of the Edinburgh Book Festival, a place that is not unfamiliar with the traditional novel.
I had us in mind when I was writing this bit. Actually, after saying that, I have to find it. Sorry.
We'll give you a moment to find it. Has anyone else got any questions they'd like to just put irrespective of the chat box?
If you want to ask any questions.
I can only see 4 people at the top of the bar, so it makes it very hard for me to chair the seminar.
There's one from Jeannie and there's one from Nicole.
Okay, thanks, Gail.
So who would well, can I invite Jeannie first, then we'll return to Nicole, because Jeannie hasn't asked a question. So Jeannie,
just what Kirsty was saying about the well-written thing. Thinking back right to the beginning of your presentation and talking about the music in the writing and the rhythm in the sentences and that kind of thing. And then going on to thinking about trauma and the broken pieces and the sharpness and so on and so forth. And what came to my mind was that Japanese form where of the broken pieces that are then reconnected with gold and made more beautiful. And that was the image that was coming into my mind. And it's that care and crafting that goes into taking something which is essentially perhaps not going to come out okay or whatever, but it's the care in the crafting and the, as you expressed so well, your own delight of working with words as a medium, as an art medium, as an art form, where everyday communication, we've all been using words since we were able to. And it's our way of expressing ourselves in the world. But when it comes to writing those words down and having a writing voice, something else happens. And either you want to go for the grammar and the well-written, or you want to go for something that is slightly more precious, something more beautiful, and something what we might call artistic. And you know, I just wanted to say those things because these are the thoughts that have been running through my mind listening to your wonderful descriptions. If I could just mention one other thing, if I'm not taking up too much time. I was reminded of an article I read in the National Geographic about some Marines returning from horrific warfare and becoming involved in an art project which was about trauma. And they were asked to create masks of what their trauma, papier-mâché masks, of what their trauma felt like to them. And these men were separated geographically. It was a project happening in different states and so on. But what was common to the masks that all these men made was that in some way or other, it described how their mouths were closed with barbed wire or were sewn shut, and the silence that had come with trauma and the inability to express it. And I was reminded of that in what you were saying about, you know, that thing of how trauma can, you know, it will find its voice in some way, as they were finding a way of expressing why they were so silent, why they were unable to speak.
You've touched on 2 beautiful images there. I mean, I can't remember the term for that Japanese.
But I will.
Anybody else might know it, but it's such
it's called
beautiful
kintsugi.
thing. Sorry?
Kintsugi.
Kintsugi.
Yeah, kintsugi. It's when they break the pot and then it's reassembled and kind of glued together with gold.
Yeah, so it's so beautiful. And the ancient Greeks also revered the cracked and the slightly, you know, the slightly imperfect kind of form. They also revered the perfect form too, but there was also, if you look at the funeral urns and things like that, and the smashing of things after a death too, you know, you can have the drink and you can throw the thing. So there's something about creativity and destruction there, isn't there? But just what you were saying about PTSD and those war veterans too. I mean, that's one of the things with PTSD, that regular talking therapy, just it's been shown not to be as useful for that. And the same with, you know, if a child is a elective mute, has elective mutism through trauma, you know, it's very difficult. So that's also, you know, those ideas of some experiences are beyond words, and
Yes.
it can take a lifetime to find your voice around those words. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. I hadn't heard that one about the masks, but it's very relevant to hear, I would say. Yes.
It's just a powerful image, yeah.
Yeah.
And also that brings our discussion gloriously full circle, because there's part of that process that is, I mean, you're engaged with that kind of thinking in your use of the second person.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very deliberate doing that. You know, Kirsty, I can't find that.
Now that's, you know,
I have found.
Because you've not written a novel. This is the thing. We know we're not reading a novel when we don't know where the parts are to be done.
No, I always have that problem. I can never find anything I've written. Okay, well,
mark of praise, Meaghan.
Okay, where will I start here? Okay. Fiction is not the same as lies, you want to protest. Fiction, to quote Arundhati Roy, gets under the skin of fact. But you know how fear of the imagination runs deep in Western culture, the fear of the made-up story, the fear of something which cannot be pinned down or held to account, a post-Enlightenment horror of what cannot be read under the microscope or subjected to empirical gaze. There is a fear of the unknown, the mysterious, and the unquantifiable. You realize it's a fear of the child self which drives all this. Fear of the child with the sandcastle, the dressing up box, the child who speaks to her imaginary friend. The fear of the feminine in the imagination. You anticipate the questions. You see yourself in a small tent off the square at the book festival with Kirsty Gunn. The event shared with another woman and chaired by a woman. The big tent, of course, will have a lone man chaired by a man with an event to himself. But that's a whole other story. So, to get back to your event, did it really happen? A man in the audience will ask. Did you really see that woman on the boat? Did you really meet in the guest house? A woman who looked like you? Did she really tell you her story? Did she really? And then another man in the audience will put up his hand. Have you read? Then, under the illusion of being helpful, he will offer you a reading list and a lecture on the role of the unreliable narrator. Yes, you'll say, after he's spoken for a few minutes and you've been too polite to interrupt, after you've resisted the urge to roll your eyes and tap your feet. I've read them, all of them, and I don't think, but the man will not hesitate to interrupt you. He's the expert from the floor who's never written a thing, but wants to write, feels entitled to write, and actually feels affronted by the fact that you, a woman, and a woman younger than himself, has actually been published on more than one occasion. But, the man will go on, there is no but, you will ache to say, still resisting the urge to interrupt him in public, although obviously he has no such qualms. And it's your bloody event, for God's sake. So you're forced to run the retort in your head, what you would like to say. There's a big difference between this book and the novels you're talking about. The women here are the polar opposite of the unreliable narrator. Believe me, the women in this story are the most reliable narrators you will ever come across. You long to say this out loud. And one day, who knows, perhaps one day soon, you will do so. Then, just as you're thinking this, lines from Claudia Rankine pulse through. Hold up, Did you just hear? Did you just say? Did you just see? Did you just do that? Then the voice in your head silently tells you to take your foot off your throat, because just getting along shouldn't be an ambition. For the time being, though, your foot is on your throat and a boot is at your neck. Getting along seems to be all you can manage. There's a gap between what you would like to say and what you would actually say to such a man. There's the sad reality of knowing that what you would actually say in public, because anything else would rend the walls and collapse the roof and blow the tent down. Thank you for the reading list, you know you would say, disappointing yourself, keeping the house of words intact, trying hard for now to suppress the knife in your voice.
That was fabulous, and a really nice kind of coda to the wonderful discussion we've been having this afternoon. Nicole, you had a question, and I think, are you still there? I can't see Nicole on the
it wasn't really a question, actually. It was just sort of more of a response to Hannah, who was helping me to understand something that I've noticed recently. So we don't need to spend time on it, but thank you for making space for me.
Oh no, I'd like to hear it.
Well, it was just Hannah's observations about kind of collective storytelling, and I guess the discussion we've been having about how that might impact on form. It was just quite curious that I'd sort of noticed quite a few novels recently which have done something I hadn't seen before, which is alternating first and third person narration. And I wonder if it's, in the light of what Hannah was saying, I wonder if it's a way of sort of putting the truth value of first person narration and third person narration under pressure in relation with each other. But I don't know. I mean, that seemed to me like a sort of newer strategy or technology that I was seeing. I kind of was being arrogant, thought I'd seen it all until I saw that. So it's making me wonder what other potential is out there for us to experiment with narrative form.
I mean, what's really interesting is that these things have been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
That strategy was absolutely in vogue in New York in particular in the early 80s. And especially, there was a particular, I think of it as a New York kind of school. But like all of these things, and going back to Johanna's remark about, these subsuming these moments of drama into something that feels like it has more heft. Why is it that we're unable to gather together the weight of all of these moments of change and consequence and make of them, instead of individual moments that then become dissolved, part of some kind of wider music? And it's interesting because it's as though we've not managed to bring a kind of female writing to consequence. And that we should end up instead with so much around us that feels as though it belongs to, as part of a much older tradition. And Meaghan, the talk that you've given today and the readings and the way you shared with us about your writing process has been such a fabulous reminder of that we do as women have debts to pay to the literature and the women who've gone on before us. And we're right to remind ourselves that there's nothing new under the sun, but that we can somehow gather up all of this experience, whether it's on the page or in our lives, and acknowledge that things may change. I mean, Helen Garner writes so beautifully about this, doesn't she? It's her subject, what women do to hold women back.
Yeah.
That we may use this kind of information to create larger novels that acknowledge this past and to break free of this moniker experimental fiction, as though we're part of some male experience that is to do with the self and the heroic action. And as you put it so beautifully earlier, this great moment of the single male voice in the tent and so on. As though nothing of that sort has been produced before.
Mm.
But we might instead, as Woolf suggests, acknowledge a collective fiction, to be part of that wider rhythm. We are the music.
I think it's really important for us to acknowledge and to privilege women in, you know, when we're talking about fiction, when we're, you know, it was really important for me in this book to quote as many women as possible, you know, and when I do quote the men, to kind of, you know, so whether it's T.S. Eliot, you know, coming up against T.S. Eliot, or just interrogating them a bit more, and what they stand for and what they stand for in the culture. And but I think it's so important. But one of the great struggles for women and women artists is that each generation, women just fall off the radar, and then they're not found again until 25 years later, you know. And you're thinking, where have these women been all this time? Yeah. And so it's a constant work of you know, excavation and bringing into the light the women whose shoulders we are standing upon, all the time, you know.
Except we're not. That's the difference. We rather, to think of another motif, we might be holding hands with each other and expanding the circumference of the circle. This is the thing. And this is what so many of our Australian colleagues are showing us in their essaying work, is that it is that we need to change the metaphors. We need to kind of undo this systemic, internalized process of good writing, if you like, and create another kind of adventure.
That may be a bit ragged or uneven or whatever. I mean, I think in here I talk about, that's right, the shoulders is probably not the right metaphor here, but the story stick being passed around, you know, that women are passing the story stick around, and we're all listening, and we're all reliable narrators of these experiences, you know. And I think that's what we're doing, you know. It's kind of passing things on in the way that generations of women pass things on to their daughters and their granddaughters and their nieces and so on. I think it's more part of a big conversation, but making sure we don't lose the women, you know, and that we don't lose the women from this generation that we're in at the moment, you know, gathering all the generations around us, the young essay writers coming through from Australia and young novelists from all over, you know, that we give them their due, and we say, you're doing fantastic work, girl. Keep going.
Meaghan, you're doing fantastic work, girl. Keep going. What a pleasure it's been. Thank you so very much for joining our Imagine Spaces discussion. And everything that we've been talking about absolutely feeds that beautiful discussion that's going on in that space. And we want to use the website as a place to share ideas and to populate it with your own essays and stories and thoughts. You've just showed us so beautifully how the novel herself can be part of that wider adventure, which is listening to ourselves think and paying attention to where our thoughts are taking us. Meaghan, thank you so very much. It's been delicious as always.
Thank you so much. And Gail too. And thank you for your fabulous work. And thank you everyone who came today. It was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you again, everybody, for coming.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.